afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 9th of May. The coronavirus statistics as of 2 o'clock yesterday were as follows. 224 newly confirmed cases of COVID-19, no new reported deaths of people who had tested positive, 2,883,384 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 1,450,798 have received their second dose. On Saturday and Sunday, only the headline statistics on new cases, deaths and vaccinations have been updated. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,938,265 people in Scotland have been tested, and of these, 1,711,017 tests were confirmed negative, with 227,248 tests being positive. But sadly, 7,661 patients in Scotland who've tested positive have died of coronavirus. There's been an election recently, apparently, and today we're only going to focus on looking at some of the headlines from that election and what the results actually might mean. Joining me to go through all of this is our Cary, a regular on Broadcasting Scotland, and Linda Fabiani, former MSP and Deputy Presiding Officer who stood down at this election. Linda, you said that you were more exhausted in this election that you weren't actually taking part in than you were in one that you were. Why was that?
I think various reasons. I think when you're in your own election and you're the candidate, everything focuses round you, and you're in your own wee bubble, really, although there's things in the periphery that come in. But I found, because I wasn't standing at all, and I was just so aware of everything that was going on. I was watching my former colleagues. I was watching all the new people that I so wanted to be MSPs. And of course, particularly Colette Stevenson, who delighted to say got a great result in East Kilbride and is taking over that slot from me. So it was just, I felt as if my head was all over the place. My body wasn't very far because, of course, you can't go out your local authority area. But my head was all over the place, and I'm just exhausted. It's very strange.
Given that there have been seismic occurrences since the last time that Scotland went to the polls, two UK general elections, now with a UK government with an 80-seat Tory majority run by Boris Johnson of all people, Brexit, Scotland being taken out of the EU against its will, the attack on devolved powers coming from Westminster, and the pandemic. You might have thought, Kat, that the results would have shown some of that. But actually, at the basic headlines in terms of number of seats won and the percentage of the vote, crucially, there's almost no change at all. Now, I appreciate there are changes underneath, but if you were coming from Mars and just looking at these results, you'd think, oh, well, the party faithful have turned up, do what the party faithful do. Clearly, nothing much has happened in the last 5 years. Move on. So why do you think we didn't see a bigger change? So, for example, how important was Brexit in this election?
I think that maybe it's more like a swan where everything's happening but below the water, even though it looks calm over the top. If you look at how the Lib Dems performed, they went and they've lost their deposits in certain constituencies. They're no longer considered a major party in Holyrood. And I think that is almost down directly to how poorly they've articulated their position on the EU. So a lot of pro-EU voters have gone over to the SNP, and also they might have gone to other parties, but they didn't stick with the Lib Dems. I think that the Lib Dems still did well in the Highland, or in the islands, in Shetney and Orkney and Shetland, because that is where they have a position that's better articulated than just we're unionists and we're not pro-EU anymore. And I do think that we have to remember that this is a proportional system. There was a lot of tactical voting going on back and forth, but a lot of the times it was cumulative. And I know on Friday we were looking at a lot of the seats at how much there was a vote share gain and loss in each constituency. So there is still stuff going on. It just didn't affect the overall vote count as much.
Interesting you mentioned Shetland and the Lib Dems. I understand that the percentage, the size of the vote for the SNP in Shetland was huge compared to, it was much higher than the regional list vote for the Lib Dems in Shetland by several thousand. And so that's the first
Good on
time,
Tom Wills.
For the first time in 50 years, that a bit of an election in Shetland hasn't been won by the Lib Dems. Now, obviously, it did impact because it was what contributed, no doubt, towards the SNP getting a list seat in Highlands and Islands. But I think that was interesting. So you mentioned tactical voting. Now, Linda, we understand that in first-past-the-post systems, tactical voting is an absolutely crucial tool that is used. And we know that there was a lot of tactical voting being suggested by certainly the Conservative Party. And although there was no formal unionist coalition between Labour and Conservative, it seems that their voters didn't need there to be a formal coalition. They were quite attuned, it would appear, to know who to vote for to be the unionist vote. A majority of the seats in Holyrood are elected by first past the post. Given that now, for the third election running, one party dominates the constituency seats, is it time to look at the voting procedures in Scotland, and is it time maybe to change from the method we've got, where the D'Hondt method for additional votes is something that the public don't really understand, because it's maybe skewing the results? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element of, I mean, it's interesting when you look the SNP got 64 out of 73 seats in the constituency. That's huge, you know, that's massive. And then you've got the additional member list. And of course, it was all set up to be broadly representative of the voting population. And crucially set up to avoid a majority government in the way that, for example, you would get in mainland Europe. Now, I don't think that people have really cottoned on to the idea of a parliament like you would get in some of the countries in mainland Europe. I think that's been shown because first past the post is always seen as the way to go, and we're still a bit enthralled in the way Westminster does things. So yes, I do think it's perhaps time we look at it again if we really do want to have that different kind of politics that we keep hearing about. And it's interesting, back in, I think it was 2003 to 2005, there was a commission set up to look at some of this stuff. Michael Russell, in fact, was on it. And they looked at it and looked at various systems. And I think from memory came down on the side of a proper proportional representation system, which would take away the first past the post. But I think the die was already cast in a way, because the first two elections we had for the Scottish Parliament, we ended up with a coalition, if you remember, of Labour and the Lib Dems, which more or less behaved and acted like a majority government. So people didn't right at the start see how our Parliament could have been a bit different. And rather than the coalition of ideas that many of us hoped would happen, we had a coalition of parties who just wanted to maintain control. So yes, I think it probably is time to look at it again, but it needs a serious look. I'm certainly not going to throw out there that I think there's a perfect system. I think it needs a serious look by serious people. And I'll be really interested actually to see the full analysis when folk like John Curtis and others are looking at what's actually happened here over the last few days and the effects of that. Because I do think the tactical voting that's gone on, and it's really interesting when you look at the figures, just even though I've not looked at them all, some of them, you can see that additional turnout that we got, which is great for democracy, but that additional turnout would seem to be very much the pro-union and the pro-independence people coming out. to give their vote where they might not have before, because they've actually seen this election as about the Constitution. For all the unionist parties would like to say, people don't care about the Constitution and we shouldn't be discussing it. I think one of the factors in this result has quite clearly been the Constitution, and we all have to look very, very carefully at the results.
Well, it was the only thing that Conservatives want to talk about. I mean, I got a leaflet through the door a couple of days before the election, and I had to turn to the final page to actually discover who it was from, because there was no party mentioned on it. It was simply Stop Indy 2. And I assumed it was probably from the Tories, and it was. So as far as they were concerned, it was only about the Constitution. In some parts of the country, they had effectively given up on trying to win constituency seats. It was all about the peach ballot paper. It's quite funny, actually, that they were tweeting using the peach emoji, and some people misunderstood what that meant.
Really? What did they think it meant?
I'd argue the
Well,
Tories
apparently the peach
misunderstood what that
emoji
meant.
can sometimes refer to a bottom, just because of the shape of a peach. So it
Well,
kind
that's
of
very
backfired.
appropriate.
It was kind of interesting. There's a few things there you said, Linda, I want to pick up on. So yes, I am no John Curtis. I hold up my hand. However, I am a bit of a number crunching geek. So I had a quick look at the popular vote, and if it was a pure PR across the whole voting scenario in Scotland, the winners, actually, the people who would have gained more seats than the actual one, were actually the Lib Dems, and the party who would have lost seats would have been SNP. So that's quite interesting.
Oh.
So given the SNP are in government, maybe they'll not change it. And that's the point, isn't it? When governments are the people who can change a voting system and it doesn't suit them, they're not going to do it, which is why you're never going to get PR in England, because it wouldn't suit the Conservatives ever to have that, because they're going to be in power forever, never, never. And we'll talk maybe a little bit later about what happened to Labour in the rest of the country. But also you're picking up this thing about, we have this almost inbuilt feeling that the way Westminster does it is right or normal. And clearly the mainstream media can't see beyond that, hence the carry on about majority, seat majority. And to be fair, we can all say, every party can say till they're blue in the face, the Scottish Parliament wasn't set up to have an overall majority, but people don't really understand that. And it's handed, I think, the Conservatives a justification for saying they set out to stop Nicola Sturgeon having an overall seat majority, and they set out to stop Nicola Sturgeon having an overall popular vote majority, and they've managed to do that, whether or not that was just the way Parliament should work. So how can we, Kat, get over... we're not going to change the system anytime soon. So how do we counter that claim by the unionist parties that they've kind of won this election in terms of what they wanted to achieve has been achieved?
Well, I do think that talking about switching the voting system is probably something that the unionists would love to talk about, because it would delay independence even further, right? Sometimes we talk about like the monarchy and republic and stuff like that, and people say, let's wait till after independence. So yeah, the voting system is something that I definitely think we should wait till after independence. And I would be a proponent of going to a straight D'Hondt system, or Jefferson system, like I like to call it, instead of the mixed methods, because I do think it's the first past the post portion that makes that narrative so easy to drive that you're talking about. I heard this morning that they even said, oh, well, you add up all the other parties together and it's a pro-union majority. Well, look at how Brexit went down in Westminster. They weren't saying that back then. A lot of this we have to ignore and let it roll off our backs, because people are people, and we're never going to stop that narrative. We just need to drive our own narrative that's stronger. And what I think, I saw a lot of positive ideas and reactions to the SNP taking the Greens on board as a minority government, or even perhaps a formal coalition, and kind of presenting a united front, saying, look, I like minority governments when you have partners like the Greens. The SNP and Greens make a dream team, really. If you look at a lot of other countries, they have like far right and far left parties sometimes in coalition, and it's quite a sight. So I think that we really have about the best outcome that we could possibly come up with, and I think that we need to look at each other's parties as, you know, separate and distinct parties that we don't expect too much out of, but also as we're having our own strengths and a way to work together towards independence. I don't think that we're going to be tripping each other up in terms of Brexit or COVID recovery or sustainable jobs. So I really think I'm very hopeful from now moving into the future.
Linda, you said that one of the disappointments of the Scottish Parliament is that we never really got into the idea of the coalition of ideas. It always fell down to coalition of power, and that's why formal coalitions before the SNP became the first minority government have happened. And obviously, the SNP have never gone into formal coalition when they have been in a minority government. Before the election, Lorna Slater was dropping hints that they would be interested in a coalition. The SNP have not responded to that. And last night she was saying quite clearly there's been no discussion. But I'm wondering whether now that they have 8 seats and that they are an even stronger partner in the pro-Indie majority, and that's the message that has to get out there, whether that gives them a bit more leverage. And if not a formal coalition, would it be feasible, for example, for the SNP to perhaps offer the Greens a seat on cabinet?
It'd be more than feasible. Can I say, first of all, I've been so impressed by Lorna Slater. I really have. I think she's been a real star of this campaign. And I'm also absolutely delighted that in my own, oh no, it's not my own region. I keep forgetting. I live just over the boundary of where I used to represent. So Central Scotland region, where East Kilbride sits, we have returned a Green list person for the first. So I'm really, really pleased about that. Now, the First Minister once appointed, and yes, it will be Nicola Sturgeon, will be thinking very, very carefully about all these things and having discussions with those she trusts to talk about the way forward. And I do think it's perfectly feasible that discussions will be ongoing with Patrick and Lorna for the Greens. And of course, there's Alison Johnson as well. She's a joint leader in the Parliament at the moment. So yes, I think it's perfectly feasible that these discussions carry on. You know, so there's lots of options. There's formal coalition, there's confidence in supply, there's, looking at saying, well, it might not be a formal coalition, but we have confidence in your group. We're on the same wavelength here, not just on independence, but also on environmental issues too. So I think there's probably a lot of mileage in that. And overarching for it is, we have an independence majority in the Scottish Parliament, a very clear independence majority. So I would like to see that formalised in some way. And let's take away from this, the SNP have only got 64 seats. It's a failure, it's not enough. I mean, that's just complete and utter nonsense. We have had a successful election in the way that elections in the Scottish Parliament work. So I would like to see this independence bloc being very upfront about being an independence bloc.
Yeah, I think that is going to be important, because while I accept obviously that there is a majority of seats that are pro-independence, the fact remains that the popular vote, and you either think the popular vote is important or you don't, but the popular vote is, as the Herald have come out today and said on the front page, split decision. And you can spin it any way you want. Split decision. Yeah, Linda?
Yeah, I was just going to say the popular vote didn't matter a damn to Boris Johnson and the Tories when it was about Brexit. The popular vote only matters when they think they're having a go at us. And unfortunately, the mainstream press buy into that. And the media, you know, when you look at what's happened in Wales, Labour have had a triumph in Wales, but in Scotland, SNP have had a failure. It's real double standards that are going on in how things are reported here.
I accept that the Tories to them, the popular vote doesn't matter a damn. But we have to be better than that. And the popular vote, surely, Kat, has to matter a damn. That's the basis of democracy, does it not?
Popular vote.
Oh, no, it's okay,
to
you're
directly
back.
translate.
That's the producer censoring this bit of the programme. Surely the popular vote is important. Whatever way you spin it, it is a split decision on who supports the union and who doesn't.
I mean, can you really use the popular vote of these different parties to represent pro-union or pro-independence? I would hesitate to do that. I would say these are the people who voted for these parties, but I would not transfer that. I would ask another question. That's for an independence referendum. That's what those opinion polls are for. 40% of Labour voters are reported to support independence. So, are they factoring that into the vote?
No, but also in the same case, there could be up to 10, 15% of SNP voters who vote SNP because they believe they're the best party for government, not least because they've been in government for so long and have done pretty well, with the odd area where they haven't done so well. And so you're right, you can't necessarily say that. But I do think this willingness to dismiss the popular vote kind of worries me slightly, especially if we were to move to something that was more proportional, then really that's kind of all that would matter.
But we're not dismissing it. We're not dismissing it, Maggie. What we've had is an election for a party to form a government and move forward with all the day-to-day politics. Within their manifesto, they said there should be a referendum on independence. So the party that won the election should now be putting their manifesto into place. And it's at that referendum that the popular vote will matter.
Indeed. And there's no suggestion that the way the vote falls now is how it would fall in a referendum, even if it was 50-50 now, if that's what the polls were saying. That's considerably higher than it was when the referendum was announced in 2012. I get that. But just to get back to spin, because let's face it, politicians spin. I'm sure, Linda, you've spun in your time yourself.
Well,
again, if you were to arrive from Mars, which is always my default position, not only would you think nothing had changed in the results, you would think that everybody won this election because everybody's got something to say they've won about. So Labour have won this election because they didn't end up with 14% of the vote. They ended up with something like 22%. The Tories have won because they stopped Nicola Sturgeon getting a majority of seats and a majority of the popular vote. And the SNP have won because they're celebrating an extraordinary and historical result. Actually, the Greens are the only ones who've really won because they've really done well, and not quite as well as they thought, but have really increased. And clearly there have been losers, and the biggest losers have been the Liberal Democrats, who are now no longer recognised as a party at Westminster, at Holyrood, and ALBA, who at 1.7% of the vote is more than half of the best polling that they were getting during the election. So, just to talk about the Liberal Democrats for a moment, Linda, what will it actually mean to them, the fact that they're now no longer a party in or not regarded as a party in Holyrood?
Yeah, or regarded as a group. Yeah. Well, there's two issues here, mainly for them. There's the corporate body and the business bureau. Corporate body is what runs the Parliament, and it's made up of the presiding officer and at least 4 other members. And it's been convention that it's the leader, each party, each group has a representative in the corporate body. So I think it'll be within the gift of the presiding officer whether they say, well, let's have a Lib Dem to carry on in the corporate body. Who knows? The Business Bureau is more important because the Business Bureau is where it's necessary to have a group to be represented on it. And it's the Business Bureau that decides the business of the Parliament. And that then translates into speaking times. It translates into whether your leader gets a question at First Minister's questions. It translates into how many opposition debates you get in a year, and also about the places on committees and whether there are committee convenerships, for example. So it's the Business Bureau that it's really, really going to be important for the Lib Dems as to whether they are regarded as a group that is worthy of that. So I think a group at the moment is 5. So, of course, the Lib Dems have gone just below that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens about that.
Okay.
It'll also be interesting to see who the presiding officer is, because, you know, with the numbers all so close, it'll be interesting to see who's elected as presiding officer, who the parties are willing to allow go forward and who they back. Yeah.
Labour, as we say, are celebrating that from a really low position in the polls of about 14% before Sarwar took over as leader. They've done slightly better. But is there anything in reality, Kat, that Labour can take away from this election that's positive?
Well, I live in one of the seats that stayed Labour, that elected a Labour MSP in the constituency, and a lot of the unionist vote did coalesce over him. So it's really where they still have a core of support. Where where do they have cores of support? Not many places. I think that one of the people that was elected on the list is will be a big problem for Labour more than the rest of us, with problems with attitude and mouthing off, and not really being solid on policy. Like, what does Labour stand for? They're trying to be everything for everyone, and they've, like I said with the Liberal Democrats, they're not really articulating their position very well. In Edinburgh Southern, I don't think that they're the party of the working people. Like, Daniel Johnson's fine, but I think he largely got reelected because he's not a threat to anyone.
It's interesting.
That's why I kind of push back
Labour
on Labour being unionist.
Apart from in Wales, and we'll speak about Wales in a minute, I think, because it's really interesting what's happened there. Obviously, Labour have had a bad election in the local councils in England. They've done well on the mayor elections. Sadiq Khan's elected again, and Andy Burnham was elected by a huge amount, which was terrific. And they're now talking about him as a new leader of Labour Party. How often are they going to change their leaders? Are they going to change them like socks? Keir Starmer's not been leader for very long. And interestingly, it's not him that's fallen on his sword over their bad results. They've gone and made a woman do that. So Labour male bully, blaming it on a woman. Quelle surprise, perhaps. But given that Labour have done so well in Wales, it beggars belief that nobody in the Labour Party is saying, why don't we go and ask the Welsh Labour Party how they're doing and how they're winning? Because they clearly are. They've got 50% of the seats in the Welsh Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and their vote share went up. And Drakeford is well respected, and I think he's quite well respected by Nicola Sturgeon. They've worked quite successfully together on kind of anti-Brexit issues. And of course, the Labour Party in Wales were very clear that should a majority for an independence on the constitutional position in Wales be elected, they wouldn't block it. Completely different from Sarwar, who's gone absolutely back to fundamental no referendum at all. So do either of you have any idea what it is about the Labour Party in Wales that is keeping them so successful? Linda?
I have a theory. I've been thinking about that a lot, actually, Maggie, because I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. And I've come to the conclusion that part of it is that when you look at the Labour Party in Wales and you look at the leaders they've had, when we were starting out in devolution, it was Rhodri Morgan who the mainstream UK Labour leadership tried to block and not have as First Minister of Wales. And as you've gone through, including Mark Drakeford, although I have to say as an aside, I think his handling of the COVID crisis has led to some of his popularity. I'm picking that up from friends that live in Wales. But on the bigger picture, I think the Welsh Labour Party have always either been perceived or have actually put the interests of Wales and the Welsh people first, culminating in Drakeford's stance on democracy in Wales. The Labour Party in Scotland have never been seen as putting Scotland first. They've been seen as a branch office of the UK Labour Party. Any leader they had, the First Ministers they had, and I leave Donald Dewar aside from this because he went far too early, and Scotland was always in Donald's heart. But when you look at the leadership since, they have bowed down to the UK position. And when you have, I think Kat mentioned earlier, the number of Labour members who, if not wanting independence, at least see that democracy means that there should be a referendum if people wish it. You have a leadership which has consistently denied that, and in fact dumped candidates who dared to espouse it. So I think that's the fundamental difference as to why Labour does well in Wales. It's because Wales sees them as putting Wales first. That hasn't happened in Scotland.
And that may be why it's keeping the nationalist vote in Wales still fairly low and not really making any breakthroughs, despite the fact that recent polling suggests up to a third of people in Wales would consider a constitutional change in their relationship with the rest of the UK. Interesting you mentioned his handling of COVID, because if you look actually at the results across Wales, England and Scotland, it's the parties who are in power who have been handling COVID who have done well. So, and in terms of who's done best well, probably the SNP have done less best well, but in terms of their share of the vote. But the Labour Party in Wales have done well, the Tory Party in England have done well, and the SNP in Scotland have done well. So how important, Kat, do you think has the COVID pandemic been and its handling been in terms of voter reaction in all three parts of the UK?
Well, I think a lot of it is down to trust. The US elections, they did elect somebody else, but I don't think any of us could argue that Trump handled the COVID pandemic terribly and people were looking for something worse. So I think it's down to the voters to decide, well, is the status quo the safest way forward or is it not? And I think that it takes a lot of mistakes for people to think, well, the status quo needs to go no matter what the risk is. So I think that's just the nature of any kind of great emergency. And we're just in a very strange situation where the pandemic crosses, it's affecting every country throughout the world, and especially the countries of the United Kingdom. And I just think that it's that, whether to not put each government like tiny numbers against each other, to say, okay, are the people overwhelmingly okay with how things are going, even if it's not perfect? I think that might be it. And Labour down in England, I mean, I don't really see what they're about. What are their values? Now they're firing Angela Rayner, who a lot of people liked. I just don't see them taking a very solid position on anything that would get people excited, that they want to believe in them, they want to put their trust in them. What's going to be different about electing Labour? Why change if it's not going to be anything but a lot of the same, I guess.
Yeah, and you're now hearing the left of Labour down south saying you need to pay more attention to the left, but then they got rid of their most left-wing leader quite recently, so I don't see that happening. And I was having a conversation with a journalist before the election who was saying the problem with Labour is their name, because they're not really any longer the party of the working class, especially in England. A lot of the working class in England have moved quite unbelievably, and for no reason I could really work out, to the Conservative Party. And you said that yourself, Kat, that in Edinburgh, it's not a working class party, so they kind of need to almost change their name or exactly change their direction. Now, I'm not particularly interested in what the Labour Party do in England, but I am interested in what the Labour Party do in Scotland. And I think, Linda, you're absolutely right that it's this feeling that they not only are not putting Scotland's interests first, but that they undermine Scotland's interests at every opportunity. That is what people say, oh, just get over yourself. It's absolutely ridiculous. Linda, one of the things, I mean, when you look at how COVID's been handled across the four nations of the UK, there's not been huge differences. There has been a four-nation approach in a lot of things. The timetables have varied a bit, but there's been a different tone, and the tone has been really important. So whether or not Boris Johnson did say that he'd let bodies pile high rather than have a second lockdown, we may never discover. But clearly, in terms of tone and presentation, Nicola Sturgeon has kind of won that, although it's not a competition. People have even suggested that because the vaccine rollout has gone so well across the UK and gone well in England, that's been a bit of a bounce for Boris Johnson, as if the vaccine rollout has been Boris Johnson's Falklands War. Do you think that's fair comment?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the worrying aspects of that, and I mentioned earlier, about friends I have in Wales. I have friends all over the UK that I've been speaking to regularly. And they're all of different political persuasions. But one of the things that has worried me from a few of them is that they have really bought into the vaccine bounce. And that's fair because the UK has dealt with the vaccine situation very, very well across the 4 nations. But it's tied in with almost a disparaging comparison with mainland Europe, almost a sort of, we did it properly, it just shows how great we are, look how rubbish they are over there, and trying to take some of our vaccines back. And there's been a real anti-Europe sentiment, some of it, even from people I'm close to, that I've found very, very difficult to deal with. And so yes, I do think there's been a vaccine bounce. I think that probably has helped in Scotland too, because whilst our NHS and our government has dealt with the rollout excellently, I mean, all we get is the supply, really, and we've dealt with the rollout and we've dealt with it very, very well. For me, the main bounce, if you like, from COVID and its handling for Nicola Sturgeon has been the confidence and commitment with which she has handled it. I mean, we went back in the doors over the last couple of weeks, and what struck me over and over again was the amount of people who were saying to me, oh, whatever you think of that wee Nicola, it's always that wee Nicola, she's put herself up front every day, she doesn't hide from anything, she lets us know exactly what's going on. Some people said, I don't actually agree with everything she's doing, but she's doing it for what she believes to be the best reasons. So there's a confidence in her, to be honest and upfront, that I think is hugely important and is reflected in the figures we've read about trust when it comes to Nicola, when it comes to Boris Johnson and indeed others. Nicola's way up front in the trust stakes.
Yeah, and let's face it, it's quite unusual to have trust in your politicians. And as a former politician, you might not like to hear that, Linda, but I think that's the reality. And integrity isn't a word you often hear voiced in the same sentence as politicians. So here's an interesting thing. The turnout's been fantastic. Although I was amazed that the BBC's interpretation of that was our turnout for the Scottish election is now up there on par with what it is for a Westminster election. So that kind of makes it evident that the Scottish elections are not just a game. I was appalled at that, but there you go. That's the BBC for you. But the turnout has been really good. And I was quite surprised because I thought a lot of people were rather disengaged. I thought they were just too exhausted because of COVID and everything else. So, and we're going to ask you this, Kat, because you haven't been an elected representative. It would be unfair to ask Linda, but I will maybe get a reaction from her. So, this is the election where the electorate have seen politicians a lot less. There's been no hustings. They've seen activists a lot less. There've been nobody tapping your door, asking you how you're going to vote, trying to persuade you to change your mind. We've been inundated with leaflets, most of which have gone straight in the bin, I imagine, not very environmental or green. And so the least engagement with the people we might want to elect, and the turnover has gone up. So is this the way forward? Should we stop having this engagement with our potential elected representatives in order to get the public to turn out?
No, I think that this is largely situational. Like the turnout, I always hope that there's high turnout in elections, but I think the stakes are really, really high. So even though there hasn't been a ton of engagement, who goes to hustings? Even before this pandemic, it was usually people who had already decided their vote. It wasn't, something where people made their decisions at that. But this is, I don't know if people have become more entrenched in their beliefs or if they've been more open-minded to clear messaging that's been on the leaflets that kind of on its way to the recycling bin if it makes it in. I spent a lot of hours doing leaflets and a lot of hours questioning the like how much leaflets are worth, electorally, monetarily, and for the environment. But I do think that one of the big things that I think is really great about Scottish politics is how much access you have to your politicians at very high levels of decision making. We don't have that in the US, and that probably has a lot to do with firearms and the ability to own them as much as anything else. But I found that a lot of people, a lot of the politicians made efforts and had to think on their feet. The parties kind of chugged along and did their thing, and they tried to innovate. But I do think that there was different politicians who really did make their mark and showed their talent for reaching people and their communication skills. So I think that we probably won't know if the turnout will be a sustained thing. I hope it is. I hope that the council elections will have a high turnout next year. But I don't think that. I think that everybody missed normal elections in every way. This was my first Scottish election, so I have nothing to compare it to, but I heard a lot of people tell me a lot of times how much they can't wait for things to get back to normal.
Linda, that was a slightly tongue-in-cheek question. I mean, I personally, I long for the day when actually hustings were, and I can remember this as a child being taken by my dad to hustings. And hearing people standing up on soapboxes, maybe a bad idea. We seem to have a Labour leader who was quite keen literally on a soapbox a few years ago, or was it an iron brew crate? Can't quite remember. But I long for the day when the public can really get as face-to-face, and as Kat says, that's a really important thing in this country, that you can get face-to-face with your elected representatives or potential ones. But really, since social media's arrival, that's kind of difficult and almost not really important, because I think Kat's right. The people that tend to go to hustings are probably party activists who go along to heckle as much as to listen, for example. But I'm just thinking, obviously you're out of politics now, at least elected representative politics. I'm sure you're not out of politics completely, Linda. What kind of elections would you like to see in the future? What kind of engagement with the public would you like to see happen in the future?
Oh my! Well, it was a very strange election, but it's been a whole strange year and a bit. I mean, one of the things I absolutely loved about being an MSP was the public engagement. I just loved it. Being out and about in the constituency, going to all these different events and visiting groups, schools, college, businesses. I've really missed all that over the last year and a bit. And then, so when we came to this election, I was really missing the one-to-one engagement as well. And I wanted to be able to take Colette around all the different groups that I'd come to know so well and who do such great work and everything else. So that wasn't able to happen. But it was really interesting when we were given the word that we could start knocking doors again, just within the last couple of weeks. We were really worried about it because we thought, maybe people don't want folk turning up at their door, and be really careful. So we very tentatively set out to do it. It was no problem at all. People were actually really glad to see us. So I think the public had also missed that engagement and excitement and buzz that comes with elections generally. But I do think because of it all, we have to think a lot about how we do things. Social media only reaches a small amount of people. Leaflets, yes, largely they end up straight in the recycling basket that sits beside the door. But then people complain if they don't get a leaflet. So there's still an expectation that this will happen. As far as hustings are concerned, what you both have said is absolutely right. You go to a big mainstream hustings and there's rows and rows of party activists, and then there's a few interested people and the odd don't know person. But the hustings that I think are useful are the sector-specific ones. Maybe, for example, there was a big one held online recently that Colette went to, and it was about children with special needs and the concerns that people have as to what the future is for their children in the education system and everything else. So these are always very, very well attended, and that's where parties can really lay out what they stand for. So I think the sector-specific ones are becoming more and more important when politicians of all the parties have to sit in front of people and justify what's in their manifesto and say what they are going to do. So I think that's probably the way forward. And fewer people are turning onto mainstream television as well to watch the day-to-day politicking. You don't turn on the news and watch it straight through anymore. You flick channels. Yeah, we have to be thinking through a lot of these things.
I personally have missed street stalls, not least because I think they are quite a visual way, and they're quite a good way of just engaging with people. And over the years, I've chased many a small child up a street with a balloon in a hope to get them to bring their mum and dad to talk. Maybe I shouldn't admit to that. But certainly street stalls, for example, were a really big feature of the referendum campaign. And the buzz that was around that is something that we need to get back as quickly as possible. Linda, a third of the people who were elected from Thursday are going to be new to Parliament. Never been, well, some of them were in Westminster. But for the third that are completely new to elected politics, what are they going to discover? What's going to surprise them about Holyrood? What's going to alarm them about Holyrood? And what are they going to find the fun things about the job?
Well, do you know, it's quite difficult because it's going to be very difficult, strange for the new people going in, because normally when folk are newly elected, everybody turns up in Parliament. You first of all have your big group meeting and everybody, talks about their excitement and what happened. And then you go into Parliament and the place is absolutely buzzing. And the Parliament staff are all there and everybody's talking. And you have, I understand that there's induction things go on. When I got elected in 99, there was no induction at all. But now there are very good induction programmes and you get to meet lots of new colleagues. That's not going to happen this time, because I understand that all the new intake are getting split over different days next week for induction. And there'll be hardly any Parliament staff there because of COVID. So it's going to be very different. There's also not going to be the social thing that automatically goes on in the first few weeks. For example, I don't know what's going to happen about the kirking of Parliament, which usually takes place. Normally there's the royals come up and everything else, and there's all that palaver. I'm out of the loop, so I don't know what's going to happen. I just know it's going to be very different from usual. So I think it'll be hard for the new intake. What will they love? I mean, you'd have to be something far wrong with you not to love the fact that you've had the privilege and honour of being elected to Scotland's Parliament. That you've got to love that. You might be disappointed that your family can't go and take part in that with you, as what would normally happen. What will they hate? Now, I'm being speculative here, because I hear a lot across the parties of candidates who say things like, I can't wait to get there and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. Do you know what? It's not that simple. It's a very disciplined environment within party structures. It's a disciplined environment within the committee and chamber structures as well. And there are certain ways that people are expected to behave. There are certain rules that people are expected to follow by their own groups. So it's not the free-for-all that people think it might be, and that you can just get up and talk about whatever you like at any time. So there might be a few disappointments at the discipline. It's hard work, very hard work. I mean, folk will be on 2 and 3 committees, for example, having to take their turn at plenaries. That might be a bit of a shock.
I know you've not ever been. I know you've not ever been in Westminster, but what do you think the biggest surprises will be from those who've transferred either directly from Westminster or after a break from Westminster into Holyrood, Linda?
Well, I can only talk about friends I've got, colleagues I've had that have done both. And it's the level of work that is required. Not chosen. I mean, but required. Like, if you're at Westminster, there's sometimes a fight to get on a committee because places are limited. Mm-hmm. Especially if you're from Scotland, there's only so many places there are. All of a sudden, you end up in Holyrood, and you've got 2, as I say, maybe 3 committees that you have to take part in. You will be required to speak probably in the chamber at least once a week. So there is quite a level of work there. There's also the expectation that people have that you will be around. I've heard some of my colleagues who've been at Westminster talking about that. But if you went away down to London, people didn't expect you to be around midweek. Whereas if you're in Holyrood, you're in that goldfish bowl, it's fairly small. And unless you're one of the representatives who live very far away, people expect you still to be at the evening meetings in your constituency, to turn up at events in your constituency. So I think it's the level of ongoing work of necessity rather than choice that people feel is a big difference in Holyrood to Westminster.
Yeah, and you're closer to the voters, there's more scrutiny and things are a bit more transparent. Kat, when so many big hitters, Linda included, announced that they were standing down, and it was across all parties that, a lot of people from the class of 1999 had said it was time for them to hang up their political boots and make room for other people. There was some concern that might have an impact on who then got elected, replacing very experienced politicians with new politicians. Obviously, within the SNP, not only did we not lose a seat that we had the last time, we gained 3 seats. And actually, some of the big hitters that left, the person who's taken over has actually increased their majority. So that was certainly the case in Mike Russell's seat. It was the case in Linda's seat with Colette Stevenson. That kind of suggests that the cult of personality, which sometimes the SNP is accused of, doesn't really exist. Would you agree?
I've kind of always found it difficult to think of personality politics as a positive thing. So I tend to agree that I think that being familiar with a candidate, feeling like you know them, isn't necessarily a cult of personality. I think that the SNP does I haven't been a member since, the dawn of time. I've been a member for the last few years, and we kind of joke in our branch that I'm I'm part of the old guard now because I haven't joined in the last 6 months. But I will say that both in my branch and in other branches of friends of mine and other people I know professionally, there's a real effort to try and engage, especially during COVID. There's been a little bit maybe more engagement in certain areas where there haven't been in others. But I do think that there's a real effort to familiarize people and to promote the people who have worked hard and put in the effort. And really, there's always problems with vetting and with candidates that pass vetting. But I really don't think that we put forward a bad candidate or an incapable candidate. I kind of worried with some of the other parties that tried to run on the list only. I worried about their competence, and I just think that competence is really the SNP's brand more so than any one person's personality.
Linda, do you want to give any speculation as to who might be in the new cabinet?
Oh, it's quite funny. We all think about these things and we speculate and we wonder. And, I haven't a clue. Nicola always keeps these things very close, and as she should. That's one of the things that a leader should do. I'm in no doubt that she'll keep up the gender balance because she feels so strongly about that. We touched earlier on the potential of green involvement, so that's an element that's there. Will she reduce the cabinet, or or expand the cabinet? Will she have more subject-prone ministers as opposed to just assistants to cabinet secretaries? There's loads of things in there. I don't know. I would say there's a couple of definite remains, like John Swinney, for example. Kate Forbes, my goodness, what a star that young woman has been. But it's difficult. A leader's always got to think of lots of things. And what I would say to, because I was in government at one point and then got the polite term reshuffled out. That's fine. A leader's got to think of all different things. They've got to think about representation across the country. They've got to think about making sure that people coming in can see that there's a path for advancement. They've got to be quite brutal and honest about people they think have served a usefulness. So it's a difficult job. Speculate? Not really, who knows? Because she always comes out with a surprise, doesn't Nicola? So,
Kat, have you got anybody?
I'm usually wrong.
Kat, have you got anybody you'd like to see given the government position?
I would very much like to see Angus Robertson in the cabinet since he
That's
was
probably
since that's
given,
who I've been
given
campaigning
experience.
for. Well, we never took it for granted, and I was part of his campaign team. I'm on the executive of the branch of Edinburgh Central, and we really didn't. We don't have. We've never had an MSP since I've lived here. We had Marco Biaggi, who's wonderful, and it was still involved in the campaign. But I'm really looking forward to seeing him because after his election, he did the rounds on the media and kind of put some of the BBC journalists in their place, and you gotta love to see that. So, but I am looking forward.
He's a consummate media performer. There's no doubt about it. He was pretty strong.
Yeah.
Linda, you mentioned the gender balance of the cabinet.
Balance.
Of course, the real winners, I think, of this election have been women, because we are now at 44% of representation of women. It's not the 50% that it needs to be, but it's a damn sight closer. Both the Greens and the SNP are now majority women, which means, quelle surprise, it's the Tories and the Lib Dems who've kept the level low. Ho hum. But I think that's terrific. So what difference, Linda, do you think that will make to the Parliament itself with more women in?
Oh, that's a question that's been doing the rounds for 20 years now. And
You said I asked original questions, Linda.
No, it's one of these questions that, when you're an MSP and a lot of students come along and ask you to help their projects and stuff, and that's always one of the questions. I've never found the Parliament sexist in the way it behaves, in the way it works, which is a different thing from some of the things we've seen in terms of harassment, misogyny and stuff. But the Parliament itself I've never seen as sexist. However, there are masculine behaviours, and I would go back to what we were talking about, that people expect to see what they see at Westminster. So there are masculine behaviours that are still deemed to be the way politicians should behave. Some of the phraseology language that's used I find quite violent, etc. Whites of their eyes, hold the feet to the fire, all that horrible stuff. So with more women, I think we may get less of that, which I think will be useful. And I would like to think that we get more sensible and logical discussion than we get with the point scoring. I think women can bring that. Quite often you see that at committees. So the more women, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
And not just an increase of women, but the Parliament's much more diverse than it was in terms of representing people who are disabled and people of colour. And obviously, SNP electing the first woman of colour ever. A few hours later, the second woman of colour elected by the Conservatives. So that has to be a good thing too, doesn't it?
It's great. And I think as our Parliament gets more, comes to that 50-50 and remains at that 50-50 balance, which, 44-45%, I'll consider that an evenly balanced Parliament, honestly. I think that will lead to less saying that women are this way, and this is what we'll get out of women, because women are vast, we have all sorts of different opinions, so we don't have to be like the saint or the villain anymore. So I think that this is opening the door, and I want to make sure that we don't slam the door behind us, and that we continue to lift each other up, and we keep looking forward to pressing more disabled members of parliament, more members from minority ethnic groups, and to keep pushing on this, because I think that even though it's a success, we need to keep going on it, and we need to realize that nothing is perfect. We can't expect to agree with every woman. We have to say that's okay. That is part of gender equity and equality, right? Is that we have people we disagree with as well as people we agree with, and that is an overall positive for Scotland and for our society.
So, just as we get to the end of the programme then, so with a more diverse parliament, with a more gender balanced parliament, with a much higher turnout for this election, without sounding too cheesy, this is going to sound cheesy, really you can say the real winner has been democracy.
Yeah.
But I think
I like cheese.
that's a good thing to be able to say that, because not every parliament is in that position, and not every parliament in the United Kingdom is in that position. So I think there was some real moments there was a lot of consensus amongst manifestos, and there were some real moments of consensus as results were coming in when Cocab Stewart was elected, when the wheelchair user woman, whose name I regret to say I have temporarily forgotten, can someone remind me? Pam, when she was elected, there was real sense across the parties, people saying this is not party political, this is a good thing. And we have to hope that that's going forward. The Scottish Parliament was designed to promote consensual politics. How that fits as you drop a binary referendum into the mix is a matter for another programme, several other programmes, I suspect, and I hope I can expect both of you back on to discuss these in the future. In the meantime, thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. I hope, however you voted in the election, you're reasonably happy with the results. As I said, every party claims to have won something from it, even if that may not in reality be true. Have a good Sunday, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.